Hey everyone, welcome back to another night of absolutely bizarre historical dreams that'll probably mess with your head in the best possible way. Tonight we're diving deep into the minds of some of the most devout, holy people in history who experienced their absolute worst nightmares. Dreams, where they committed every single sin they'd spent their entire lives avoiding. I'm talking about monks, priests, and saints who woke up in cold sweats, questioning everything they believed about themselves and their souls. So before you settle in with your favorite pillow and maybe that weighted blanket you definitely don't need but absolutely love, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But honestly, only if you genuinely enjoy these weird historical rabbit holes I keep falling down. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you in bed in Bangkok at 2 a.m., folding laundry in London at midnight? Drop it in the comments. It's always wild to see how these strange stories travel across time zones. Now get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare to enter the conflicted minds of history's most tormented dreamers. And hey, if you drift off somewhere in the middle of tonight's journey, that's totally fine. Some would say that's the whole point. Though honestly, some of these stories are so psychologically twisted you might end up more awake than when you started. So picture this. It's 1387 in Canterbury, England, and Brother Thomas, a Benedictine monk who'd taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience when he was barely 18, suddenly starts having the most vivid, disturbing dreams of his 40-year religious life. We're talking about a man who'd literally never been alone with a woman since entering the monastery, who'd spent 2 decades copying religious manuscripts and praying for hours every day. This guy was so devout that other monks came to him for spiritual guidance. Thomas had entered religious life with the kind of sincere enthusiasm that was actually pretty rare, even in medieval monasteries. His parents had expected him to take over the family farm, but Thomas felt what he described as an irresistible calling to serve God. He'd given up everything, potential marriage, children, material possessions, even his own name, taking the religious name Brother Thomas when his birth name had been William. For 22 years, this commitment had felt natural and satisfying. Thomas genuinely enjoyed the rhythm of monastic life, the early morning prayers, the hours spent in silent copying of religious texts, the simple meals eaten in communal silence, the evening services that marked the end of each day. He'd never experienced what other monks sometimes whispered about, moments of doubt, longing for worldly pleasures or regret about the path they'd chosen. But starting in October of that year, Brother Thomas began experiencing dreams, so intensely carnal and detailed that he'd wake up screaming and immediately run to the chapel to pray for forgiveness. In these nightmares, because that's what they were to him, absolute nightmares, he would find himself in taverns, drinking wine and laughing loudly with groups of people. He'd dream about eating rich foods, wearing expensive clothes, and worst of all, pursuing women with an enthusiasm that horrified his waking mind. The dreams started simply enough. Thomas would find himself in what appeared to be a merchant's house, sitting at a wooden table laden with foods he'd never seen in real life. There would be roasted meats glistening with fat, white bread made from the finest flour, fruits that seemed to glow with impossible colors, and wine so red it looked like liquid rubies. In these early dreams, Thomas would simply eat and drink with a hunger that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. I mean, can you imagine? The poor guy had probably never even tasted wine, and here his subconscious is throwing him into medieval bachelor parties every single night. But as the weeks passed, the dreams became more complex and more disturbing. The simple pleasure of food and drink expanded into elaborate social scenarios where Thomas was the center of attention, telling jokes that made people laugh, sharing stories that impressed listeners, and generally experiencing the kind of social validation he'd never sought in his waking life. In one recurring dream, Thomas found himself at a harvest festival in a village he'd never seen but somehow knew intimately. He was wearing clothes made of fine wool dyed in brilliant colors, deep blues and rich greens that caught the light and made him feel handsome and important. People sought out his conversation, deferred to his opinions, and treated him like someone whose presence made their celebration more meaningful. The most disturbing aspect of these social dreams was how natural and right they felt. Thomas's dream self wasn't awkward or uncertain in these social situations. He was confident, witty, and genuinely enjoying himself in ways his waking mind found completely foreign. It was as if his sleeping mind had access to social skills and desires that his conscious personality had never developed. But then came the dreams that really terrified him. Thomas began dreaming about women with a specificity and intensity that seemed impossible for someone who'd never been intimate with another person. These weren't vague, generic romantic fantasies. They were detailed encounters with particular women who seemed completely real and individual. The dreams were so realistic that Thomas would wake up feeling guilty about things he'd never actually done. He could taste the wine on his tongue, smell the perfume of women he'd never met, and feel the weight of silk clothes he'd never worn. According to his journal, yes, he documented all of this because medieval monks were obsessive record keepers. He could remember specific conversations he'd had in these dreams, jokes he'd told, songs he'd sung in taverns. One woman appeared in his dreams repeatedly, an innkeeper's daughter named Margaret, who had auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. In his dreams, Thomas would court her with a persistence and romantic skill that amazed him. He would bring her wildflowers, compose poetry in her honor, and win her affection through charm and wit he never knew he possessed. The physical intimacy in these dreams was so detailed and emotionally authentic that Thomas would wake up feeling like he'd actually betrayed his vows. He could remember the texture of Margaret's skin, the sound of her laughter, the way she looked at him with love and desire. These weren't just sexual fantasies, they were complete emotional relationships that included tenderness, companionship, and deep mutual affection. What made these dreams absolutely torturous for Brother Thomas was their incredible detail and emotional authenticity. He wasn't just dreaming about generic sinful behavior, he was experiencing complete, alternative lives where he was a different person entirely. In one recurring dream, he was a wealthy merchant who traveled between cities, sampling local wines and romancing innkeepers' daughters. In another, he was a court musician who performed for nobles and lived a life of artistic indulgence. The merchant dreams were particularly vivid. Thomas would find himself in different towns across England, each rendered in his sleeping mind with geographical and architectural details that seemed far too specific to be purely imaginary. He would negotiate business deals during the day, attend social gatherings in the evening, and maintain romantic relationships with women in multiple cities. In these dreams, Thomas owned beautiful horses, wore clothes made from the finest materials, and carried a purse full of silver coins that gave him freedom to purchase whatever caught his fancy. He would stay in the best inns, eat at the finest tables, and generally live with a material luxury that was the complete opposite of his monastic vows of poverty. The psychological impact on Thomas was devastating. He started sleeping less, trying to avoid the dreams entirely. He'd pray throughout the night, slap himself awake whenever he felt drowsiness coming, and even ask the abbot for permission to sleep in the chapel where holy surroundings might protect him from these visions. Thomas developed elaborate rituals to try to prevent the dreams. He would spend an extra hour in prayer before bed, asking God to protect his sleep from temptation. He ate even less than usual, hoping that hunger might prevent the vivid food dreams. He avoided looking at any decorative elements in the monastery, worried that visual beauty might somehow feed his sleeping mind's appetite for luxury. But the dreams persisted and actually became more frequent and detailed the more Thomas tried to avoid them. It was like his repressed desires were staging a full-scale rebellion against his conscious devotion. The harder he fought against them during waking hours, the more elaborate and compelling they became during sleep. The situation reached a crisis point when Thomas began having what he called nested dreams, dreams within dreams where he would think he'd woken up from a sinful dream, only to discover he was still dreaming and still engaging in behavior that violated his vows. These nested dreams were so realistic that Thomas would sometimes spend entire days uncertain whether specific memories were from waking life or dream experiences. In one particularly disturbing nested dream, Thomas dreamed that he woke up in his monastery cell, felt guilty about a romantic dream, and went to confess to the abbot. But during the confession, he realized he was still dreaming when the abbot transformed into Margaret. the woman from his romantic dreams, and began seducing him in the confessional booth itself. These dreams within dreams made Thomas question his grip on reality. If his sleeping mind could create such convincing false awakenings, how could he be sure that his actual waking life wasn't also some kind of elaborate dream? Maybe his entire monastic existence was itself a fantasy, and his real life was actually one of worldly pleasure and romance. The soul is a battlefield where angels and demons wage war while we sleep, and sometimes we wake up on the wrong side of victory. The really fascinating part of Thomas's story is what happened when he finally confessed these dreams to Abbot William. Instead of being horrified or suggesting exorcism, the abbot told Thomas something that completely changed his perspective. He said that God sometimes sends challenging dreams to test the faith of his most devoted servants. The dreams weren't evidence of Thomas's hidden sinfulness. They were proof that his commitment to holiness was so strong that it required extraordinary testing. Abbot William had seen similar cases during his 30 years of religious leadership. He explained that monks who were truly committed to their vows sometimes experienced what he called dreams of opposition, intense visions of everything they'd given up, presented in the most appealing possible way. These dreams served to strengthen rather than weaken religious commitment by forcing monks to consciously choose their spiritual path over attractive alternatives. The abbot shared his own experience of similar dreams during his early years as a monk. He dreamed about becoming a wealthy landowner with a large family, living in a magnificent manor house and wielding political influence throughout the region. These dreams had been so appealing and realistic that he'd seriously considered leaving monastic life. But Abbot William had eventually realized that his dreams were showing him not what he secretly wanted, but what he'd consciously chosen to reject in favor of something more meaningful. The dreams weren't temptations to leave religious life. They were reminders of why he'd entered it in the first place. This interpretation transformed Thomas's relationship with his dreams. Instead of fighting them or feeling guilty about them, he began to see them as spiritual challenges to overcome. He developed techniques for maintaining his religious identity even within the dreams, sometimes managing to pray or remember his vows even while his dream self was behaving in ways that contradicted everything he believed. Thomas began to approach his dreams with scientific curiosity rather than guilt and terror. He would wake up and immediately record every detail he could remember, analyzing the dreams for insights into human psychology and spiritual development. His journal from this period reads like an early psychological study, documenting the relationship between conscious desires and unconscious fantasies. He noticed that his dreams often reflected concerns from his waking life, but transformed them into scenarios of worldly pleasure. When he was worried about the monastery's financial situation, he would dream about being wealthy. When he felt isolated from human companionship, he would dream about romantic relationships. When he felt intellectually understimulated by copying manuscripts, he would dream about being a scholar or artist. This analysis helped Thomas understand that his dreams might be his mind's way of processing the sacrifices his religious life required. Instead of simply suppressing all thoughts of worldly pleasure, his sleeping mind was exploring these alternatives in safe fantasy environments. The dreams allowed him to experience what he'd given up without actually abandoning his chosen path. Thomas's journals from this period reveal someone wrestling with fundamental questions about identity, desire, and the nature of sin. Are we responsible for our dream actions? Do our sleeping minds reveal our true selves, or do they create false selves that have nothing to do with our waking character? Can experiencing sin in dreams actually protect us from committing sin in reality? He began to develop a theological framework that saw dreams as psychological laboratories, where different aspects of human nature could be explored without real-world consequences. His dreams weren't revealing hidden corruption in his character, they were allowing him to understand the full spectrum of human desire, while choosing to commit himself to spiritual rather than material goals. The dreams eventually stopped after about 8 months, as suddenly as they'd begun. Thomas never experienced anything similar again, and he went on to become one of the most respected theological scholars of his generation. He wrote extensively about the relationship between dreams and spiritual development, arguing that challenging dreams could serve as tools for strengthening faith rather than evidence of moral weakness. His treatise on the testing of souls through dreams became influential throughout medieval Europe, helping other religious figures understand that disturbing dreams might be part of spiritual development rather than evidence of spiritual failure. Thomas argued that God sometimes allowed souls to experience temptation in dreams precisely because they were strong enough to resist it in reality. Thomas lived to be 68, spending his final years as a spiritual advisor to younger monks who struggled with similar challenges. He would tell them that dreams of worldly pleasure weren't signs of weakness, but evidence that they'd made sacrifices significant enough to require processing. The mind that never dreams of alternatives has probably never made meaningful choices. His approach to dream interpretation influenced medieval psychology and theology for generations, contributing to a more sophisticated understanding of human consciousness that recognized the complexity of spiritual development. Thomas showed that true holiness might involve integrating and understanding all aspects of human nature rather than simply suppressing the inconvenient parts. In 1401, at the convent of St. Clare in Assisi, Italy, Sister Catherine, a nun known throughout the region for her extreme fasting and humble devotion, began having dreams that challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her relationship with God. Catherine had taken her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience so seriously that she ate only bread and water most days, slept on the stone floor of her cell, and spent up to 12 hours daily in prayer and meditation. Catherine had entered religious life at 14, not because her family forced her into it, but because she'd experienced what she described as a direct calling from God during a particularly moving Easter service. While other girls her age were thinking about marriage and starting families, Catherine felt an overwhelming desire to dedicate her entire life to spiritual pursuits. She'd begged her parents to allow her to enter the convent, promising them that this was her deepest and most authentic desire. For 8 years, this commitment had felt completely natural and fulfilling. Catherine genuinely loved the rhythm of monastic life, the early morning prayers before dawn, the long hours of silent meditation, the simple work of tending the convent garden, the evening services where the community gathered to sing ancient hymns. She found joy in activities that other nuns sometimes struggled with, particularly the fasting that was meant to purify the soul by disciplining the body. She was, by all accounts, exactly what a medieval nun was supposed to be: self-denying, pious, and completely dedicated to spiritual rather than earthly concerns. Other nuns looked up to her as an example of perfect religious devotion. She'd never shown interest in material possessions, rich food, or personal recognition. When visitors came to the convent, Catherine would often be pointed out as an example of how beautiful spiritual dedication could be. Catherine's reputation for holiness extended beyond her immediate community. People from nearby towns would sometimes request her prayers for sick family members or difficult situations. Local church authorities had begun to discuss the possibility that Catherine might be developing the kind of spiritual gifts that occasionally led to sainthood. She was exactly the kind of nun that the medieval church held up as an ideal. But then came the dreams that turned her world upside down. In these nightly visions, Catherine found herself living a life of shocking excess and vanity. That was the complete opposite of everything she'd chosen and everything she believed about herself. She'd dream about hosting elaborate feasts where she consumed massive quantities of rich foods, roasted meats that dripped with fat and spices, sweet pastries that dissolved on her tongue like edible jewels, wine that tasted like liquid pleasure, fruits so perfect they seemed almost magical. But it wasn't just eating in these dreams. She was gorging herself with an enthusiasm that disgusted her waking mind. In her dream feasts, Catherine would consume entire roasted chickens by herself, devour platters of delicate pastries without pause, and drink wine until she felt dizzy with pleasure. She would eat with her hands, letting the juices run down her fingers, completely abandoning the careful, mindful approach to food that had characterized her waking life. The irony here is almost cruel, right? A woman who'd spent years training herself to want nothing suddenly dreaming about wanting everything, and wanting it desperately. The food dreams were disturbing enough, but they were just the beginning. Catherine's sleeping mind seemed determined to explore every form of indulgence she'd rejected in her waking life. She began having dreams about luxurious clothing that felt like wearing clouds made of silk. In these visions, she would dress in gowns of deep purple and rich gold, fabrics so fine they seemed to shimmer with their own light. In her dreams, Catherine would stand before mirrors, an item completely absent from convent life, and admire her reflection with a vanity that horrified her. She would arrange her hair in elaborate styles, wear jewelry that caught the light and made her feel beautiful, and generally revel in physical appearance in ways that contradicted everything she'd been taught about spiritual development. Even worse than the gluttony were the dreams of pride and vanity. Catherine would find herself dressed in beautiful gowns, admiring herself in mirrors, and demanding that others praise her beauty and intelligence. She'd dream about being the center of attention at social gatherings, telling stories that made people laugh and admire her wit. In some dreams, she was a noblewoman who demanded that servants cater to her every whim. The pride dreams were perhaps the most psychologically complex. Catherine would find herself in grand social situations where she was clearly the most important and admired person present. People would seek out her conversation, defer to her opinions, and compete for her attention. In these dreams, she had opinions about everything and expected those opinions to be taken seriously. She would dream about being consulted on matters of philosophy, politics, and theology, not as a humble nun seeking spiritual guidance, but as an authority figure whose wisdom was recognized and celebrated. People would travel from distant places specifically to hear her speak, and she would hold court like a queen, dispensing advice and basking in the admiration of her followers. In some of her most disturbing pride dreams, Catherine found herself actually mocking religious life. She would laugh at the simplicity of other nuns, make jokes about the pointlessness of fasting and prayer, and present herself as someone who was too sophisticated and intelligent to be satisfied with such basic spiritual practices. These dreams felt like complete betrayals of everything she'd dedicated her life to believing. What made these dreams particularly torturous for Catherine was how much she enjoyed them while she was asleep. Unlike Brother Thomas, who maintained some sense of guilt even within his sinful dreams, Catherine's dream self embraced excess with complete joy and satisfaction. She'd wake up with the taste of rich food still on her tongue and a lingering sense of contentment that horrified her. The physical sensations from these dreams were incredibly realistic. Catherine could remember the exact texture of silk against her skin, the weight of jewelry around her neck, the satisfaction of being full after eating rich food. She could recall specific conversations where people had praised her intelligence, the feeling of being desired and admired, and the intoxicating sense of power that came from being the center of attention. The psychological conflict was intense. During the day, Catherine would feel disgusted by her dream experiences and increase her fasting and prayers to compensate for what felt like actual sins. She'd spend hours begging God's forgiveness for enjoying things in dreams that she'd spent years rejecting in waking life. But at night, her dreams continued, and her dream self continued to revel in everything her waking self despised. Catherine began developing elaborate rituals to try to prevent or counteract her dreams. She would spend additional time in prayer before sleep, asking specifically for protection from dreams of temptation. She increased her fasting to even more extreme levels, eating only bread and water on most days and completely abstaining from food on others. She slept with religious relics under her pillow, hoping their holy presence might purify her sleeping mind. But none of these measures had any effect on her dreams. If anything, the more she tried to suppress her dream experiences through extreme religious practices, the more elaborate and appealing her dreams of indulgence became. It was as if her unconscious mind was responding to increased deprivation by creating increasingly detailed fantasies of satisfaction and pleasure. Catherine's struggles became even more complex when she realized that the dreams were affecting her daily spiritual practice. She found herself distracted during prayers by memories of dream feasts. While copying religious texts, she'd catch her mind wandering to the beautiful clothes she'd worn in her dreams. She was experiencing something like spiritual double consciousness, living two completely contradictory lives in the same body. The situation reached a crisis point when Catherine began having dreams where she was not just indulging in earthly pleasures, but actually mocking her religious vows. She'd dream about laughing at other nuns for their simplicity, making jokes about religious practices, and even questioning the existence of God. These dreams felt like complete betrayals of everything she'd dedicated her life to believing. In one particularly disturbing dream, Catherine found herself hosting a dinner party where the guests were all the saints she'd spent years praying to, but in her dream, they were ridiculous figures who were competing for her attention and approval. She would mock St. Francis for his poverty, laugh at St. Clare for her simplicity, and generally present herself as superior to the very people she'd tried to model her life after. These dreams of spiritual mockery were so realistic that Catherine would wake up feeling like she'd actually committed the sin of blasphemy. She could remember specific jokes she'd made about religious practices, cruel observations about the pointlessness of spiritual discipline, and arguments against the existence of divine love that seemed convincing even to her waking mind. Sometimes our sleeping minds become stages where all our rejected selves perform the lives we chose not to live. Catherine's crisis deepened when she began to wonder if her dreams were revealing her true nature, if perhaps her years of religious devotion had been a form of self-deception, and her real personality was actually the proud, gluttonous, vain person who appeared in her dreams. Maybe her conscious commitment to humility and service was just an elaborate performance, and her authentic self was the one who craved luxury, admiration, and personal satisfaction. The psychological torture was intensified by the fact that Catherine couldn't discuss these dreams with anyone else in her community. The other nuns saw her as a model of spiritual perfection, and confessing that she was having dreams about mocking their shared way of life would have been devastating, not just to her own reputation, but to their faith in the possibility of genuine spiritual development. What's remarkable about Catherine's story is how she eventually found a way to integrate these disturbing dream experiences into her spiritual understanding. After months of torment, she began to interpret her dreams not as evidence of hidden sinfulness, but as reminders of the human appetites she'd successfully overcome through religious discipline. The breakthrough came during a conversation with the convent's oldest nun, Sister Margarita, who was approaching 70 and had spent over 50 years in religious life. Catherine had been struggling with whether to confess her dreams to the Mother Superior, terrified that doing so might result in her being expelled from the convent or subjected to exorcism. Sister Margarita noticed Catherine's distress and gently pressed her to share what was troubling her. When Catherine finally described her dreams of gluttony and pride, she was amazed by the older nun's reaction. Instead of being shocked or horrified, Margarita began laughing with what seemed like recognition and relief. "My child," Sister Margarita said, "do you think that 50 years of religious life have been easy for me? Do you think I've never been tempted by the very things I gave up? Your dreams aren't showing you who you really are. They're showing you what you've chosen not to become." Margarita explained that she'd experienced similar dreams during her own early years in the convent, though hers had focused more on romantic love and family life than on food and social recognition. She'd spent months feeling guilty and confused, wondering if her dreams revealed hidden desires that invalidated her religious commitment. But eventually, Margarita had come to understand that her dreams were actually evidence of the strength of her religious choice. Only someone who had genuinely given up significant earthly pleasures would have dreams that explored those pleasures in such detail. Her sleeping mind was essentially processing the magnitude of what she'd sacrificed in choosing religious life. This perspective completely transformed Catherine's understanding of her dream experiences. She started to see the dreams as a form of spiritual strength training. Just as physical exercise requires resistance to build muscle, perhaps spiritual development required exposure to temptation to build moral strength. Her ability to wake up from dreams of excess and return to her chosen life of simplicity was, she decided, evidence of her commitment to her vows rather than betrayal of them. Catherine developed a practice of using her dream experiences as material for meditation. Instead of trying to forget the details of her gluttonous or prideful dreams, she would remember them clearly and use them to contemplate the nature of desire, the appeal of worldly pleasures, and the reasons she'd chosen a different path. This approach transformed her relationship with both her dreams and her religious practice. She became more compassionate toward other nuns who struggled with earthly desires, understanding from her dream experiences just how appealing those desires could be. She also developed a more nuanced understanding of human psychology, recognizing that spiritual development involved integrating and understanding all aspects of human nature rather than simply suppressing them. The dreams gradually became less frequent and less disturbing as Catherine learned to view them as spiritual tools rather than spiritual failures. She went on to write some of the most psychologically sophisticated religious texts of her era, drawing on her dream experiences to explore questions about human nature, desire, and the complexity of spiritual development. Catherine's later writings reveal someone who had developed a remarkably mature understanding of the relationship between conscious choice and unconscious desire. She argued that true spiritual development required acknowledging and understanding all aspects of human nature, including the parts that contradicted our conscious values and commitments. In 1456, in a small Spanish monastery near Toledo, Father Miguel faced what he later described as the devil's greatest assault on my soul, a series of dreams so violent and disturbing that they challenged not only his religious vows but his fundamental understanding of his own nature. Miguel was a Franciscan priest known throughout the region for his gentle demeanor, his work with the poor, and his complete commitment to the Christian principle of loving one's enemies. Miguel had entered religious life at 22, not as a young idealist seeking spiritual adventure, but as a mature man who'd witnessed enough violence and injustice in the world to believe that only divine love could provide meaningful solutions to human suffering. He'd grown up during a period of almost constant warfare between Christian and Muslim territories in Spain, and he'd seen firsthand how cycles of violence and revenge destroyed communities and families. His father had been a soldier who'd spent years fighting in various conflicts, coming home with stories that had convinced young Miguel that physical force only created more problems than it solved. His mother had been killed during a raid when he was 16, and instead of seeking revenge, Miguel had chosen to dedicate his life to the kind of love and service that might prevent such tragedies from happening to other families. For 15 years, this commitment had felt completely authentic and sustainable. Miguel genuinely enjoyed working with people who were suffering, the sick, the poor, the grieving, and the desperate. He developed a reputation for infinite patience, for being able to listen to people's problems without judgment, and for finding peaceful solutions to conflicts that seemed hopeless to everyone else. He'd never raised his hand against another person, never spoken in anger, and had spent 15 years ministering to the sick and homeless with a patience that other priests found almost supernatural. Miguel was the priest people came to when they needed comfort, forgiveness, or someone to listen to their troubles with infinite compassion. Local authorities often consulted Miguel when dealing with disputes between families or communities because he had an almost magical ability to help people see past their anger and find common ground. He would spend hours listening to both sides of conflicts, asking gentle questions that helped people understand their own motivations and recognize their opponent's humanity. Miguel's approach to ministry was based on his deep conviction that every person contained both the capacity for love and the capacity for violence, and that spiritual development involved nurturing the first while starving the second. He believed that responding to aggression with more aggression was like trying to put out fire with oil. It only made the problem bigger and more destructive. But starting in the autumn of 1456, Miguel began having dreams that revealed or created a completely different version of himself. In these nightmares, Miguel found himself in scenarios where he responded to frustration and injustice with explosive, brutal violence that felt utterly foreign to his waking personality, yet somehow deeply satisfying. He'd dream about beating merchants who cheated the poor, attacking nobles who abused their servants, and engaging in physical confrontations with a ferocity that seemed to come from some hidden part of his soul. I mean, We're talking about a guy who probably apologized to mosquitoes before swatting them, suddenly dreaming about medieval street fights. The dream started simply, with Miguel observing injustices that he would normally address through prayer, counseling, and gentle persuasion. But in his sleep, instead of responding with his characteristic patience and diplomacy, he would find himself taking direct, physical action with devastating effectiveness. In one recurring dream, Miguel would encounter a wealthy merchant who was cheating peasant families by using false weights to measure grain. In his waking life, Miguel would handle such a situation by speaking privately with the merchant, appealing to his conscience and, if necessary, involving church authorities to address the problem through proper channels. But in his dream, Miguel would confront the merchant publicly, and when the man refused to admit his dishonesty, Miguel would grab him by the throat and physically force him to return the stolen grain to the families he'd cheated. The dream Miguel would feel an incredible rush of satisfaction as he watched the corrupt merchant stumble backwards, terrified and finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. The dreams were incredibly detailed and emotionally authentic. Miguel could feel the satisfaction of landing punches, the rush of adrenaline during confrontations, and the intoxicating sense of power that came from using physical force to solve problems. He'd wake up with his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists, and a lingering sense of righteous anger that took hours to fade. What made these dreams particularly disturbing was how justified the violence felt within the dream context. Miguel wasn't dreaming about random brutality or senseless aggression. Instead, he was dreaming about using violence to protect the innocent, punish the wicked, and defend the weak. His dream self was essentially a vigilante priest, using physical force to achieve the justice that his waking methods of prayer and persuasion seemed unable to accomplish. In another recurring nightmare, Miguel would discover a nobleman beating his servants for minor infractions. In real life, Miguel would approach such a situation by speaking with the nobleman privately, appealing to his better nature and perhaps involving other church authorities if gentle persuasion failed. But in his dreams, Miguel would physically intervene, fighting the nobleman with his bare hands and beating him so severely that he would never again dare to abuse those under his power. The physical sensations in these dreams were remarkably realistic. Miguel could feel the impact of his fists against his opponent's bodies, the strain in his muscles as he grappled with stronger men, and the satisfaction of watching bullies and oppressors crumple under his assault. He could taste the metallic flavor of blood in his mouth, feel the burn of exertion in his lungs, and experience the primal satisfaction of physical dominance. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how effective his dream violence seemed to be. In his nightmares, problems that had taken months or years to address through peaceful means were solved immediately through the application of force. Corrupt merchants would instantly become honest, abusive nobles would immediately reform their behavior, and various forms of injustice would disappear as soon as Miguel demonstrated his willingness to use physical punishment. The psychological impact was profound. Miguel began to question whether his gentle approach to ministry was actually effective, or whether he'd been naive to believe that love and patience could address the world's injustices. His dreams seemed to be showing him an alternative version of himself that was more decisive, more forceful, and possibly more effective at actually helping people. During his waking hours, Miguel found himself fantasizing about the confrontations from his dreams. When he encountered real instances of injustice or abuse, he would catch his mind wandering to scenarios where he might solve the problem through direct physical intervention. These fantasies felt simultaneously foreign to his conscious personality and deeply appealing. The situation became more complex when Miguel's dreams started influencing his waking behavior. He found himself speaking more sharply to merchants who overcharged the poor, showing less patience with nobles who came to confession without genuine remorse, and generally adopting a more confrontational approach to his ministry. His congregation noticed the change. Some appreciated his new assertiveness, while others missed his former gentle manner. Miguel began having dreams where he wasn't just fighting individual oppressors, but leading groups of peasants in violent uprisings against corrupt authorities. In these dreams, he would organize and inspire common people to take up arms against nobles who exploited them. using his religious authority to justify revolutionary violence. These dreams were particularly troubling because they felt so emotionally authentic and politically compelling. Miguel would wake up feeling like he'd experienced genuine leadership, like he'd tapped into reserves of courage and decisiveness that his conscious mind had never accessed. The dream Miguel was charismatic, inspiring, and effective in ways that his waking self sometimes felt he wasn't. But the dreams also terrified him because of how much he enjoyed them. Unlike the monks and nuns we've discussed who felt guilty about their dream experiences, Miguel found himself waking up with a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. He'd spent years feeling frustrated by his inability to truly help people who were trapped in cycles of poverty and abuse, and his dreams offered the fantasy of direct, immediate, effective action. Miguel's crisis deepened when he realized that his violent dreams were making him more effective in certain aspects of his work. When he spoke with the authority and intensity that his dreams had given him, people listened more carefully. When he confronted injustice with righteous anger rather than gentle disappointment, changes sometimes actually occurred. Local merchants began treating their customers more fairly after. Miguel started addressing them with the stern authority he'd learned in his dreams. Nobles who had previously ignored his gentle suggestions about treating their servants better suddenly began paying attention when he spoke with barely contained anger about the spiritual consequences of abuse and exploitation. Perhaps the most dangerous dreams are not the ones that show us who we fear we are, but the ones that show us who we might become. The most psychologically complex aspect of Miguel's dream experiences was how they forced him to confront the relationship between anger and love, between violence and justice. His dreams weren't showing him random aggression or mindless brutality. They were showing him violence in service of values he genuinely held, used to protect people he genuinely cared about. In one particularly vivid dream, Miguel found himself defending a group of orphan children from bandits who were trying to kidnap them for slavery. In real life, such a situation would require Miguel to seek help from secular authorities and hope that armed soldiers would arrive in time to protect the children. But in his dream, Miguel single-handedly fought off the kidnappers, using strength and fighting skills he'd never possessed in waking life. The satisfaction he felt in this dream wasn't just about personal power or dominance. It was about the joy of being able to directly and immediately protect innocent people from harm. His dream self could do things that his real-life commitment to nonviolence prevented him from doing. Even when those actions might save lives or prevent suffering, Miguel began to wonder if his commitment to nonviolence was actually a form of moral cowardice disguised as spiritual virtue. Maybe there were situations where love required the willingness to use force, where protecting the innocent demanded the ability to harm those who threatened them. His dream seemed to be showing him a version of himself that was willing to take on the spiritual burden of violence in order to serve the greater good. The turning point in Miguel's story came during Holy Week of 1457, when he had a dream that was different from all the others. Instead of dreaming about committing violence himself, he dreamed about being the victim of the same kind of brutal treatment he'd been inflicting on others in his previous dreams. He experienced the fear, pain, and helplessness of being attacked by someone stronger and more powerful. In this dream, Miguel was the corrupt merchant being beaten by an angry priest, the abusive noble being attacked by a righteous vigilante, the oppressor experiencing the same brutality he'd inflicted on others. He felt the terror of being overpowered, the humiliation of being publicly shamed through violence, and the lasting trauma that comes from being beaten by someone who believes their cause justifies their actions. This dream gave Miguel a completely different perspective on his violent fantasies. He realized that his dream self's righteous violence, however justified it seemed, was still violence that caused real suffering to real people. The satisfaction he'd felt in his dreams came at the cost of someone else's pain and dignity, even when that someone was a person whose behavior he genuinely opposed. The experience of being victimized in his dream helped Miguel understand that violence, even violence committed for good reasons, created trauma that extended far beyond its immediate political or social effects. The people he'd beaten in his dreams weren't just corrupt merchants or abusive nobles. They were human beings with their own fears, hopes, and capacity for change. Miguel developed a new approach to his ministry that combined the gentleness of his original nature with the assertiveness he'd learned from his dreams. He became known for speaking truth to power with unwavering courage, but without the personal satisfaction or anger that had characterized his dream violence. He learned to channel the energy and determination from his dreams into forms of resistance that didn't require causing harm to others. Instead of beating corrupt merchants in back alleys, Miguel began organizing economic boycotts that forced them to change their practices or lose their livelihoods. Instead of physically attacking abusive nobles, he used his growing reputation and religious authority to socially isolate them until they reformed their behavior. He found ways to be forceful and effective without crossing the line into actual violence. The violent dreams gradually faded as Miguel found ways to express his passion for justice through nonviolent but still forceful means. He organized collective action among the poor, wrote powerful letters to church authorities about social injustices, and developed a reputation as someone who would stand up to powerful people without compromising his fundamental commitment to love and compassion. Miguel's experience suggests that sometimes disturbing dreams serve as psychological laboratories, where we can explore aspects of ourselves that we need to understand and integrate rather than simply suppress or fear. His dreams had shown him the appeal and effectiveness of violence, while also teaching him about its costs and limitations. He spent his final years training younger priests in what he called assertive compassion, the ability to confront injustice with firmness and courage while maintaining genuine love for all people involved, including those whose behavior needed to change. Miguel died at 68, respected throughout Spain as a priest who could challenge the powerful without becoming corrupted by anger or hatred himself. In the winter of 1203, at the monastery of Cluny in France, Brother Jerome, a learned monk who spent his days copying and illuminating religious manuscripts, began having dreams that didn't just challenge his personal faith, but seemed to attack the very foundations of Christian doctrine itself. Jerome was considered one of the most intellectually gifted monks of his generation, known for his theological scholarship and his ability to defend church teachings against various heresies that periodically swept through medieval Europe. Jerome had entered monastic life at 19, not because of a dramatic spiritual conversion or family pressure, but because he'd fallen in love with the intellectual aspects of religious study. He'd grown up in a family of merchants who valued education and had received the best schooling available to someone of his social class. When he encountered the vast libraries and scholarly traditions of the monastery, he felt like he'd found his calling. He'd spent 12 years in devoted study of scripture, church doctrine, and the writings of the church fathers. Jerome could recite vast portions of the Bible from memory, had mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and was regularly consulted by abbots from other monasteries on complex theological questions. His illuminated manuscripts were considered works of art as well as religious scholarship, combining theological precision with visual beauty that made abstract concepts accessible and compelling. Jerome's reputation extended far beyond his immediate community. Church authorities in Paris and Rome knew his work and occasionally requested his opinions on doctrinal disputes. He'd written several treatises defending Orthodox Christian theology against various heretical movements, and his arguments were considered so sophisticated and convincing that they were used in theological debates throughout Europe. But then came the dreams that turned his scholarly certainty into profound doubt and terror. In these nightmares, Jerome found himself arguing passionately against everything he'd spent his life believing and defending. He'd dream about standing before assemblies of monks and lay people, presenting compelling arguments against the existence of God, the divinity of Christ, the authority of the Church, and the truth of Christian Scripture. Imagine being so good at something that even your dreams can't resist making you excel at its complete opposite. The dreams began simply, with Jerome finding himself in familiar academic settings, monastery libraries, theological debates, scholarly discussions, but instead of defending Christian doctrine as he normally would, He would hear himself making sophisticated arguments against core Christian beliefs. Initially, these dream arguments were relatively simple skeptical positions that Jerome had encountered and refuted in his scholarly work. But as weeks passed, the dreams became more elaborate and intellectually challenging. Jerome's sleeping mind seemed to be drawing on all his theological knowledge and scholarly training, but turning these tools against everything he held sacred. He would dream about constructing systematic critiques of Christian doctrine that were more sophisticated than any heretical arguments he'd encountered in his waking studies. The most disturbing aspect of these dreams wasn't just that Jerome was expressing heretical ideas, it was that his dream arguments were sophisticated, well-reasoned, and genuinely compelling. His sleeping mind seemed to be drawing on the same scholarly abilities he used to defend Christianity, but turning them against everything he'd spent his life proving and believing. In one recurring dream, Jerome would find himself debating with other monks about the contradictions in Scripture, pointing out historical inconsistencies, questioning the reliability of ancient texts, and suggesting that Christian doctrine was a human construction rather than divine revelation. His dream self would cite specific passages, reference historical events, and construct logical arguments with the same precision he brought to his waking theological work. These weren't random blasphemies or emotional rejections of faith. They were carefully constructed intellectual challenges that demonstrated deep knowledge of both Christian doctrine and its potential weaknesses. Jerome would wake up disturbed not just by the content of his dreams, but by their scholarly quality and logical coherence. In another recurring nightmare, Jerome would find himself teaching a group of younger monks, but instead of instructing them in orthodox theology, he would be systematically undermining their faith through rational argument. He would present evidence that the Gospels were written long after the events they described, suggest that miracle stories were later additions to originally simpler narratives, and argue that the development of Christian doctrine reflected political needs rather than spiritual truth. The most terrifying aspect of these teaching dreams was how compelling and pedagogically effective his dream self seemed to be. The young monks in his dreams would listen with growing understanding and agreement as Jerome dismantled their religious beliefs through careful reasoning and scholarly evidence. He would wake up feeling like he'd actually corrupted innocent souls, even though everything had happened only in sleep. What terrified Jerome most was that his dream arguments made sense. His sleeping mind wasn't just spewing random blasphemies, it was constructing coherent, intellectually honest challenges to beliefs he'd never seriously questioned while awake. The dreams forced him to confront doubts and questions that his conscious mind had successfully suppressed or rationalized away. Jerome began to fear that his dreams were revealing his true beliefs, that despite years of devoted study and apparently sincere faith, he was actually a skeptic or heretic who'd been deceiving himself about his own convictions. Maybe his scholarly approach to religion had inadvertently led him away from genuine faith rather than deeper into it. During his waking hours, Jerome tried to counter his dream heresies by intensifying his religious practices. He spent additional hours in prayer, increased his fasting, and threw himself into even more rigorous study of orthodox theological texts. But the more he studied, the more material his dreams seemed to have for constructing sophisticated arguments against everything he was trying to prove. Jerome's crisis deepened when he realized that his extensive theological knowledge was actually feeding his heretical dreams. His familiarity with various historical criticisms of Christianity, his awareness of textual inconsistencies in Scripture, and his understanding of how Christian doctrine had developed over time were all being used by his sleeping mind to construct arguments against the faith he consciously embraced. In one particularly disturbing dream, Jerome found himself in a debate with St. Augustine himself, using Augustine's own methods of logical analysis to argue against Augustine's conclusions about divine grace, free will, and the nature of salvation. The dream Jerome was essentially out-arguing one of Christianity's greatest theologians by using Augustine's own intellectual tools against him. The psychological torture was intensified by Jerome's growing awareness that his dream self was often more intellectually honest than his waking self. In his dreams, he would acknowledge uncertainties and contradictions that his conscious mind worked hard to explain away or ignore. His sleeping mind seemed to be pursuing truth wherever it led, while his waking mind was committed to reaching predetermined conclusions. The situation became genuinely dangerous when Jerome's dreams started affecting his daily work. He'd be copying a passage of scripture and suddenly remember a dream argument about why that particular passage was historically unreliable. He'd be teaching younger monks about church doctrine and find himself mentally rehearsing the counterarguments his dream self had presented. Jerome became terrified that he might accidentally voice one of his dream heresies during actual theological discussions. He started avoiding scholarly debates, declined invitations to speak at other monasteries, and generally withdrew from the intellectual activities that had defined his religious life. His reputation for theological expertise began to suffer as he became increasingly reluctant to engage with complex doctrinal questions. The crisis reached its peak when Jerome had a dream that was different from all the others. Instead of arguing against Christianity in academic settings, his dream self was teaching these heretical ideas to a group of younger monks, corrupting their faith and leading them away from God. He woke up feeling like he'd actually committed the sin of leading others astray, even though it had happened only in his sleep. In this nightmare, Jerome was standing before a classroom of novice monks, all young men who had recently entered religious life with sincere faith and genuine devotion. But instead of nurturing their spiritual development, Dream Jerome was systematically destroying their religious beliefs through rational argument and historical criticism. He could see the confusion and growing doubt in their faces as he presented evidence that their core beliefs might be unfounded. Some of the young monks in his dream began to weep as they realized that their entire worldview was being undermined by someone they had trusted as a spiritual teacher. Others became angry, accusing Jerome of destroying their faith without offering anything to replace it. The mind that seeks truth must sometimes wrestle with doubt, and the battlefield of that struggle is often the realm of dreams where our deepest questions fight our deepest certainties. What saved Jerome from complete spiritual breakdown was a conversation with the monastery's oldest monk, Brother Francis, who was approaching 90 and had spent 70 years in religious life. Francis had joined the monastery as a young boy and had witnessed numerous spiritual crises among his fellow monks over the decades. When Jerome finally confessed his dream struggles to Francis, the old monk surprised him by laughing with what seemed like recognition rather than shock. Francis explained that he'd seen similar cases throughout his long religious career, and that Jerome's experience was actually more common among scholarly monks than most people realized. "My boy," Francis said, "do you think faith that has never been tested is worth having? Do you think God wants followers who believe simply because they've never seriously considered the alternatives?" Francis explained that Jerome's dreams weren't evidence of hidden heresy, but proof that his faith was strong enough to withstand intellectual challenge. The fact that his sleeping mind could construct sophisticated arguments against Christianity, and that his waking mind could recognize them as wrong, demonstrated both intellectual honesty and genuine spiritual conviction. According to Francis, many of the greatest theological minds in Christian history had experienced similar periods of profound doubt and questioning. Augustine himself had gone through years of intellectual crisis before developing his mature theological positions. Thomas Aquinas had wrestled with philosophical challenges to faith that were every bit as sophisticated as Jerome's dream arguments. Francis suggested that Jerome's dreams might actually be a form of advanced theological education. His sleeping mind was essentially providing him with the strongest possible arguments against his faith, allowing him to develop more sophisticated and intellectually honest defenses of Christian doctrine. This perspective completely transformed Jerome's understanding of his dream experiences. Instead of seeing them as spiritual failures or evidence of hidden heresy, he began to view them as challenging but valuable opportunities for intellectual and spiritual growth. Jerome began keeping detailed records of his heretical dreams, analyzing the arguments his sleeping mind presented and developing thoughtful responses. This process actually made him a much more effective theologian because he could anticipate and address the kinds of doubts and questions that challenged people's faith. He discovered that his dream arguments, while sophisticated and compelling, often relied on assumptions that could themselves be questioned. His sleeping mind was excellent at identifying weaknesses in Christian doctrine, but it wasn't necessarily better at evaluating alternative explanations for human existence, meaning, and morality. Jerome developed the practice of treating his dreams as intellectual sparring partners. He would wake up from a heretical dream and spend time carefully analyzing the arguments his sleeping mind had presented, looking for both their strengths and their limitations. This process strengthened both his critical thinking skills and his appreciation for the complexity of religious questions. The dreams gradually became less frequent as Jerome learned to see them as intellectual exercises rather than spiritual attacks. He realized that his ability to construct powerful arguments against Christianity in his dreams was actually evidence of how thoroughly he understood Christian doctrine and how seriously he took questions about its truth. Jerome went on to write some of the most nuanced and psychologically sophisticated theological texts of the medieval period, drawing on his experience of having wrestled with serious doubt to help others navigate their own spiritual struggles. His treatise on doubt as the foundation of faith became influential throughout medieval Europe, arguing that genuine faith required the courage to honestly examine challenging questions rather than simply avoiding them. He developed a reputation as a theologian who could address the most sophisticated intellectual challenges to Christianity, while maintaining genuine humility about the limits of human understanding. Jerome's approach influenced medieval theology by demonstrating that faith and rigorous intellectual inquiry could strengthen rather than threaten each other. Jerome lived to be 73, spending his final decades as a mentor to younger scholars who struggled with similar conflicts between intellectual honesty and religious commitment. He would tell them that doubt wasn't the opposite of faith, but rather faith's most demanding teacher. At the Abbey of Saint-Ragon in Poitiers, France, in 1298, Mother Scholastica, the abbess who had led her community of nuns with wisdom and humility for over a decade, began experiencing dreams that revealed desires she'd thought she'd successfully renounced forever. Scholastica had taken her vows young, at 15, and had genuinely embraced the religious life with enthusiasm rather than resignation. She'd been elected abbess by unanimous consent when she was only 28, and her leadership was characterized by fairness, spiritual depth, and complete dedication to her community's welfare. Scholastica had entered religious life during a period of significant political upheaval in France. Her family had been minor nobility who had lost most of their wealth and influence during various conflicts between rival claimants to regional power. Instead of seeing the convent as a refuge from worldly disappointment, Scholastica had embraced it as an opportunity to build something meaningful that transcended the petty power struggles that had consumed her family. For 15 years, her commitment to religious leadership had felt completely authentic and fulfilling. Scholastica genuinely loved the administrative aspects of running a religious community, managing resources, resolving conflicts between nuns, maintaining relationships with church authorities, and ensuring that her abbey served the broader community effectively. She found deep satisfaction in work that combined practical problem-solving with spiritual purpose. She owned nothing beyond her simple habit and a few religious books, had no interest in personal recognition beyond her small community, and had spent years training herself to find joy in service rather than achievement. Scholastica was exactly what medieval religious authorities wanted in an abbess, intelligent but humble, decisive but selfless, competent but devoid of personal ambition. Her abbey was known throughout the region as one of the best managed religious communities, with efficient agriculture, excellent care for the sick and poor, and a reputation for fair dealing in all business matters. Church inspectors regularly held up Saint-Ragon as an example of how religious communities should be organized and led. But then her dreams began to reveal a completely different version of herself, one that craved power, recognition, and luxury with an intensity that shocked her. In these nightmares, Scholastica found herself as a wealthy noblewoman living in magnificent estates, wearing beautiful gowns and jewelry, and commanding the respect and envy of everyone around her. She'd dream about hosting elaborate social gatherings where she was the center of attention, telling stories that impressed guests and receiving compliments about her intelligence, beauty, and sophistication. It's like her subconscious was running some kind of medieval Netflix series where she was the wealthy, powerful protagonist instead of a humble nun. The dreams began with relatively simple fantasies of material luxury. Scholastica would find herself in grand manor houses with tapestries depicting her family's achievements, furniture made from the finest woods, and tables laden with foods that represented wealth and status. She would wear gowns made from silk and velvet in colors so rich they seemed to glow with their own light. In these early dreams, Scholastica would simply enjoy the sensory experience of luxury, the feel of fine fabrics against her skin, the taste of spiced wine and delicate pastries, the warmth of fires built with expensive wood. She could remember waking up with vivid sensory memories of textures, flavors, and scents that were completely foreign to her austere religious life. But the dreams quickly evolved beyond simple material indulgence to explore more complex forms of worldly ambition. Scholastica began dreaming about being recognized and celebrated for her intelligence and leadership abilities, but in secular rather than religious contexts. She would dream about being consulted by kings and nobles on matters of policy and governance, about having her opinions sought and respected by the most powerful people in France. What made these dreams particularly disturbing was how much her dream self enjoyed the experience of being admired and envied. Scholastica would wake up with vivid memories of the satisfaction she'd felt when people praised her wit, deferred to her opinions, or sought her approval. The emotional reality of being important, influential, and admired lingered for hours after waking. In one recurring dream, Scholastica found herself at the royal court in Paris, serving as an advisor to the queen on matters of statecraft and diplomacy. She would wear elaborate court dress that marked her as someone of significant rank and influence, and nobles would compete for her attention and approval. The dream Scholastica would dispense wisdom and make decisions that affected the entire kingdom. These court dreams were psychologically complex because they weren't just about personal vanity or material pleasure. They were about having the power to make meaningful changes in the world on a scale that her actual position as abbess couldn't match. Her dream self could influence policy that affected thousands of people, resolve conflicts between nations, and shape the political development of France itself. The dreams became more complex and troubling when they started featuring her actual religious community. Scholastica would dream about transforming her abbey into a luxurious palace, wearing elaborate religious garments that were more about displaying wealth than expressing devotion, and ruling over her nuns with the authority of a queen rather than serving them as a spiritual mother. In some dreams, she was making political alliances with powerful nobles, using her religious position to gain influence in secular affairs, and essentially treating her role as abbess as a stepping stone to greater worldly power. Her dream self would manipulate church politics, accumulate wealth for the abbey and herself, and enjoy the deference that came from being both religiously and politically influential. These dreams of religious corruption were particularly disturbing because they felt so realistic and achievable. Scholastica could see exactly how her genuine, administrative skills and religious authority could be leveraged for personal advancement if she chose to pursue worldly rather than spiritual goals. The psychological impact on Scholastica was profound because these dreams revealed desires that felt completely authentic. This wasn't like dreaming about random, foreign experiences. These were dreams about wanting things she could actually see herself enjoying. The luxury, respect, and power her dream self craved seemed genuinely appealing in ways that disturbed her deeply. During her waking hours, Scholastica began to notice that she was paying more attention to the respect and deference her position commanded. She found herself enjoying conversations with visiting church officials who treated her as an important figure, taking pleasure in the efficient operation of her abbey, and feeling satisfied when other abbesses sought her advice on administrative matters. She started questioning whether her years of religious service had been motivated by genuine spiritual devotion or by a subtler form of ambition, the desire to be seen as holy, wise, and worthy of respect. Maybe her humility was just another kind of pride, and her service to others was actually a way of accumulating spiritual authority and admiration. Scholastica began to question whether her years of religious service had been motivated by genuine spiritual devotion or by a subtler form of ambition, the desire to be seen as holy, wise, and worthy of respect. Maybe her humility was just another kind of pride, and her service to others was actually a way of accumulating spiritual authority and admiration. The situation became even more troubling when Scholastica realized that some aspects of her dream life were influencing her waking behavior. She found herself paying more attention to how impressive she seemed during community meetings, taking subtle pleasure when other abbesses sought her advice, and feeling irritated when her opinions weren't immediately accepted by her nuns. She started noticing that she enjoyed the respect and deference her position commanded, and that she was perhaps more attached to being seen as a wise leader than she'd previously admitted to herself. Her dreams were essentially holding up a mirror that showed her the worldly desires she'd thought she'd successfully transcended. The dreams evolved to include scenarios where Scholastica was using her religious position for political influence on a national scale. She would dream about being summoned to advise the king on matters of governance, about her abbey becoming a center of political power that influenced royal policy, and about herself becoming one of the most important figures in French politics. In these political dreams, Scholastica would use her reputation for wisdom and moral authority to build alliances between religious and secular leaders, accumulating influence that extended far beyond her abbey walls. She would host meetings between nobles and church officials, broker deals that affected entire regions, and generally operate as a power broker who shaped the political landscape of medieval France. The most insidious sins are often the ones that disguise themselves as virtues, and the most honest dreams are the ones that strip away our noble self-deceptions. What made Scholastica's story different from the other religious figures we've discussed is how she chose to address her dream revelations. Instead of seeing them as temptations to resist or spiritual failures to overcome, she decided to treat them as important information about her psychological and spiritual state. The turning point came when Scholastica had a conversation with Sister Marguerite, her most trusted advisor and the nun who had known her longest. Marguerite had entered the abbey shortly after Scholastica and had watched her develop from an enthusiastic young nun into an effective leader. More importantly, Marguerite had the courage to speak honestly about what she observed, even when it might be uncomfortable. Scholastica decided to share her dream experiences with Marguerite, describing in detail the visions of luxury, political power, and worldly recognition that had been troubling her sleep. Instead of being shocked or concerned, Marguerite listened thoughtfully and then asked a series of questions that helped Scholastica understand her dreams in a new way. "When you dream about having political influence," Marguerite asked, "what kinds of changes do you imagine making? When you dream about luxury and recognition, what specifically appeals to you about those experiences?" Through these conversations, Scholastica began to realize that her dreams weren't just about vanity and worldly ambition. They were also about her frustrated desire to make larger-scale positive changes in the world. Her dream self's political influence was often used to reduce conflict, promote justice, and create conditions where people could live better lives. Scholastica began having regular conversations with Sister Marguerite about the complex motivations behind religious service. They discussed how the desire to be good could sometimes become entangled with the desire to be seen as good, and how spiritual pride could masquerade as humility. These conversations revealed that Scholastica's dreams of worldly power weren't entirely selfish. Many of her fantasies involved using influence and resources to help people on a scale that her position as abbess didn't allow. Her dream self's political maneuvering was often motivated by genuine desire to reduce suffering and promote justice, even when it was also motivated by desire for recognition and status. This process of honest self-examination actually made Scholastica a better leader. She became more aware of when her decisions were motivated by genuine service versus subtle ego needs. She developed practices for checking her motivations before making important choices, and she became more understanding of other nuns who struggled with similar conflicts between spiritual ideals and human desires. Scholastica learned to distinguish between different types of ambition and desire for recognition. Some of her dream impulses were indeed about vanity and ego gratification that needed to be resisted or redirected. But others were about legitimate desires to serve more effectively and make positive changes in the world. That could be channeled into more appropriate forms of action. Rather than trying to eliminate all traces of ambition or desire for recognition, Scholastica learned to acknowledge these aspects of her personality while choosing not to be controlled by them. Her dreams had taught her that true spiritual maturity might involve integrating all aspects of human nature rather than simply suppressing the inconvenient parts. She began to use her administrative skills and political wisdom more deliberately to benefit her broader community. Instead of fantasizing about royal courts, she worked more actively with local nobles to improve conditions for peasant families. Instead of dreaming about personal luxury, she focused on making her abbey more beautiful and comfortable for all the nuns who lived there. The dreams gradually shifted from being sources of guilt and confusion to becoming tools for ongoing spiritual self-assessment. Scholastica developed the practice of using her dream experiences as material for meditation and prayer, exploring what they revealed about her current spiritual state and areas where she needed to focus her attention. Her approach to dream integration became influential among other religious leaders of her era, contributing to a more psychologically sophisticated understanding of spiritual development that recognized the complexity of human motivation even within religious contexts. Scholastica wrote several treatises on the relationship between spiritual service and human psychology that were studied throughout medieval Europe. She lived to be 67, spending her final years as a mentor to younger abbesses who struggled with similar conflicts between spiritual ideals and human desires for recognition and influence. Her legacy was a more nuanced understanding of religious leadership that acknowledged both the spiritual and psychological dimensions of authority and service. In 1342, during the early years of what would later become known as the Black Death, Brother Bartholomew of the Dominican monastery in Avignon faced a crisis that challenged not just his individual faith, but his understanding of God's justice and the meaning of religious devotion itself. Bartholomew had spent 8 years in devoted service, caring for the sick, teaching children, and ministering to the poor with a cheerfulness and optimism that made him beloved throughout his community. Bartholomew had entered religious life at 24, not as a young idealist seeking adventure, but as someone who had witnessed enough suffering in the world to believe that religious faith provided the only meaningful response to human pain and uncertainty. He'd grown up in a family that had experienced its share of hardship. His father had died young, leaving his mother to raise 4 children with very limited resources. But Bartholomew had never allowed these difficulties to shake his fundamental conviction that God's love ultimately made sense of all suffering. His decision to join the Dominicans had been motivated by their emphasis on both contemplative prayer and active service to the community. Bartholomew genuinely enjoyed the combination of intellectual study and practical ministry that defined Dominican life. He found deep satisfaction in spending mornings in prayer and study, then afternoons visiting sick people in their homes, teaching children from poor families, and helping organize charitable assistance for families in crisis. He genuinely believed that God rewarded faith with protection, that prayer could heal illness, and that religious devotion provided meaning and purpose that transcended worldly suffering. Bartholomew was known for his infectious enthusiasm about spiritual life and his ability to help others find hope even in difficult circumstances. For 8 years, this optimistic faith had seemed completely justified by Bartholomew's experience. He'd seen prayers answered, witnessed people recover from serious illnesses after receiving religious ministration, and watched families find comfort and strength through their relationship with God during times of loss and difficulty. His work seemed to be making a real difference in people's lives. Bartholomew had developed a reputation throughout Avignon as someone who could help people maintain hope and faith during their darkest moments. Families dealing with serious illness would specifically request his prayers and visits. People facing financial ruin or family crises would seek him out for spiritual counseling. Other monks looked to him as an example of how joyful and effective religious service could be. His theological understanding was relatively simple but deeply felt. Bartholomew believed that God was fundamentally loving and just that faith provided protection from the worst forms of suffering, and that religious devotion would ultimately be rewarded with divine care and blessing. He saw evidence of God's goodness everywhere he looked, and he genuinely couldn't understand how anyone could doubt the reality of divine love. But as reports of a devastating plague began reaching Avignon from the east, Bartholomew started having dreams that shattered his fundamental assumptions about faith, divine justice, and the value of religious life. In these nightmares, Bartholomew saw himself witnessing unimaginable suffering, entire families dying horrible deaths, children abandoned and starving, holy people suffering just as much as sinners, and prayers going completely unanswered while good people died in agony. His dreams showed him a world where faith provided no protection, virtue received no reward, and God seemed either absent or indifferent to human pain. The dreams began simply, with Bartholomew finding himself in familiar settings, homes where he'd previously ministered to sick people, churches where he'd led prayer services, streets where he'd distributed food to the poor. But in his nightmares, these familiar places had been transformed into scenes of devastation and despair. The dreams were horrifically detailed. Bartholomew could see the physical effects of disease, smell the stench of death, and hear the cries of people begging God for relief that never came. He'd dream about performing last rites for dozens of people in a single day, watching children die while their parents prayed desperately for miracles that didn't happen. In one recurring nightmare, Bartholomew found himself in the home of the Moreau family, people he'd known and ministered to for years. Pierre Moreau was a devout craftsman who attended daily mass, gave generously to charity, and had raised his children to be faithful Christians. His wife Marie was known throughout their neighborhood for her kindness to elderly and sick neighbors. But in Bartholomew's dream, the entire Moreau family was dying from plague. The parents and their 4 children were all suffering from the horrible symptoms he'd heard described in reports from the East: fever, swollen lymph nodes, delirium, and eventual death. Despite their lifelong devotion and Pierre's desperate prayers, God seemed completely absent from their suffering. Bartholomew would dream about trying to comfort the dying children while their parents begged him to explain why God was allowing this to happen to a family that had been so faithful. In the dream, he had no answers that seemed adequate or honest. His usual reassurances about God's love and the meaning of suffering felt hollow and ridiculous in the face of such overwhelming tragedy. But what made these dreams truly devastating was that his dream self began to lose faith entirely. In the nightmares, Brother Bartholomew would find himself questioning God's existence, abandoning his religious duties and eventually renouncing his vows to flee from a world that seemed abandoned by divine care. The transformation of his dream self was gradual but complete. Initially, Dream Bartholomew would maintain his faith while struggling to understand why God was allowing such suffering. He would continue praying, offering comfort to the dying, and trying to find meaning in the tragedy around him. But as the dream plague worsened and more good people died horrible deaths while their prayers went unanswered, Dream Bartholomew would begin to doubt everything he'd previously believed. He would stop praying, avoid religious services, and eventually conclude that God either didn't exist or didn't care about human suffering. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Bartholomew had never seriously doubted God's goodness or the meaning of religious life, but his dreams were forcing him to confront the possibility that faith might be nothing more than wishful thinking in the face of random, meaningless suffering. In his most disturbing dreams, Bartholomew would find himself stripping off his religious habit, abandoning the monastery and fleeing Avignon to escape a plague that had revealed the emptiness of everything he'd devoted his life to believing. His dream self would become a bitter, cynical man who warned others against the false hope of religious faith. These dreams of apostasy were psychologically devastating because they felt so emotionally authentic. Bartholomew would wake up feeling like he'd actually experienced the complete collapse of his faith, like he genuinely lived through the discovery that his entire worldview was based on illusion and self-deception. During his waking hours, Bartholomew tried to counter these dream doubts by intensifying his prayers and charitable work. But every night brought more dreams of divine absence, unanswered prayers, and faith revealed as inadequate to address real human suffering. The cruel irony is that Bartholomew's dreams were essentially giving him a preview of exactly what was about to happen to Europe. The Black Death would kill roughly one-third of the population, and it would indeed challenge the faith of countless people who watched their prayers go unanswered while loved ones died horribly. Bartholomew's dreams became more detailed and realistic as reports from the East became more frequent and more disturbing. He would dream about specific symptoms of plague that matched exactly what travelers were describing. He would see the social breakdown that occurred when entire communities were devastated by disease, the abandonment of social customs, the breakdown of law and order, the collapse of economic systems. In one particularly vivid dream, Bartholomew found himself in a church where hundreds of people had gathered to pray for deliverance from plague. But instead of providing comfort or hope, the religious service became a scene of despair as people realized that their prayers were having no effect on the disease that was killing their families and friends. He watched people in his dream begin to question not just God's willingness to help them, but God's very existence. He saw devout Christians tear up religious texts, smash religious statues, and curse God for abandoning them in their time of greatest need. The dream Bartholomew found himself agreeing with their angry rejection of faith that had proven useless. What made Bartholomew's situation even more complex was that his dreams began to seem prophetic when the plague actually reached Avignon in 1348. Everything he'd seen in his nightmares began playing out in reality: mass death, overwhelming suffering, and the apparent failure of religious faith to provide protection or even comfort. But something unexpected happened. Instead of losing his faith as his dream self had done, Bartholomew found that his 6 years of dream preparation had actually strengthened his ability to maintain hope and purpose in the face of unimaginable tragedy. When the real plague arrived in Avignon, Bartholomew discovered that his dreams had prepared him psychologically and spiritually for challenges that destroyed many people's faith entirely. He'd already wrestled with questions about divine justice, the problem of suffering, and the limits of religious explanation. Instead of being shocked and overwhelmed by the collapse of his simple faith, he was ready to develop a more mature and complex understanding of spirituality. The dreams had forced Bartholomew to confront the possibility that faith might not be about believing that God would prevent suffering, but about choosing to respond to suffering with love, service, and hope even when ultimate meanings remain mysterious. His 6 years of nightmare preparation had taught him that religious commitment might need to survive even the apparent absence of divine intervention. Sometimes our worst dreams prepare us for our greatest tests, teaching us that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the choice to serve love even when love seems absent from the world. When the actual plague struck Avignon, Bartholomew became one of the most effective and compassionate caregivers in the city. His willingness to work with dying people, to provide comfort without false promises, and to maintain hope without naive optimism made him a source of genuine support during the crisis. Unlike many religious figures who either fled the plague or became paralyzed by the apparent failure of their faith to provide protection, Bartholomew was able to continue serving because his dreams had already forced him to develop a faith that could survive the worst possible circumstances. He spent the plague years caring for the sick, comforting the dying, and helping organize practical responses to the crisis. But his approach was different from his pre-dream ministry. Instead of offering easy reassurances about God's plan or promising that faith would provide protection, Bartholomew acknowledged the mystery and horror of the situation while still choosing to act with love and service. Bartholomew realized that his dreams had been theological education, forcing him to wrestle with the deepest questions about faith, suffering, and divine justice before he faced them in reality. When the real plague arrived, he was psychologically and spiritually prepared for a crisis that destroyed many people's faith entirely. His ability to acknowledge doubt while choosing to act with love and service made him a source of genuine comfort to people who were struggling with the same spiritual crises he'd experienced in his sleep. He could speak honestly about the difficulty of maintaining faith during catastrophic suffering while still demonstrating that such faith was possible. The dreams had taught him that faith might not be about believing that God would prevent suffering, but about choosing to respond to suffering with love, service, and hope, even when ultimate meanings remained mysterious. Bartholomew survived the plague and lived for another 30 years, becoming one of the most respected spiritual advisors in post-plague Europe. His writings about faith during times of catastrophic suffering influenced medieval theology and helped establish more psychologically sophisticated approaches to pastoral care during crises. He developed a reputation as someone who could help people navigate spiritual crises without offering false comfort or demanding that they suppress honest questions and doubts. Bartholomew had learned from his dreams that mature faith required the courage to continue serving love even when love seemed absent from the world. In 1165, at a Cistercian monastery in northern England, Brother Augustine began having dreams that revealed corruption and hypocrisy within his own religious community. Augustine was a simple monk who joined the monastery hoping for a quiet life of prayer and contemplation. He wasn't politically minded, wasn't particularly scholarly, and had no ambitions beyond faithful service to God. Augustine had entered religious life at 32, older than most novices after spending years as a carpenter in a small village near York. He'd never been particularly religious as a young man, but a series of personal tragedies, the death of his wife in childbirth, followed by the loss of his infant son to fever, had left him seeking meaning and purpose that secular life couldn't provide. The monastery had offered him refuge from grief and a chance to dedicate his remaining years to something larger than his personal pain. For 3 years, this simple approach to religious life had been completely satisfying. Augustine enjoyed the rhythm of communal prayer, found peace in the manual labor that kept the monastery running, and appreciated the sense of brotherhood that developed among men who shared common goals and daily routines. He'd never questioned the integrity of his religious community or doubted the sincerity of his fellow monks' commitment to their vows. But his dreams started showing him scenes that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his fellow monks. He'd dream about seeing his abbot secretly hoarding money meant for charity, about witnessing other monks engaging in the very sins they preached against, and about discovering that much of what appeared to be religious devotion was actually elaborate performance designed to impress visitors and church authorities. The dreams began with Augustine finding himself wandering through the monastery at night, observing activities that normally occurred when most monks were asleep. In these nocturnal visions, he would see Abbot William counting coins in his private chamber, money that Augustine somehow knew was supposed to be distributed to poor families in the surrounding villages. These dreams troubled Augustine deeply because they seemed to be accusing people he respected of serious moral failures. He'd never suspected any corruption in his community, and his conscious mind found it difficult to believe that such widespread hypocrisy was possible. Abbot William had always seemed genuinely committed to the principles of Cistercian life: simplicity, charity, and service to God and community. But the dreams persisted and became more detailed. Augustine would dream about discovering hidden caches of expensive food and wine in places where such luxuries violated monastic rules. He'd see monks who preached about the dangers of worldly attachment secretly enjoying material pleasures that contradicted their vows of poverty. In one recurring dream, Augustine found himself in the monastery's scriptorium, where monks copied religious texts and created illuminated manuscripts. But instead of working on sacred texts, his dream colleagues were forging documents that would benefit the monastery financially, creating false records of donations and property ownership that would increase their wealth and influence. Over the course of several months, Augustine began to notice small details during his waking hours that confirmed what his dreams had shown him. He'd observe behaviors, overhear conversations, and witness interactions that gradually revealed that his dreams had been surprisingly accurate about the gap between his community's public image and private reality. It's like his subconscious was putting together clues that his conscious mind had been too trusting or naive to recognize. Augustine noticed that Abbot William always seemed to have access to better food than what was served to the common monks. He observed that certain monks were exempted from the harsh physical labor that others were required to perform. He began to pay attention to how differently his community behaved when church inspectors visited. compared to their normal daily interactions. The psychological impact was devastating in a different way from the other monks we've discussed. Augustine wasn't wrestling with his own hidden sins or desires. He was dealing with the discovery that his religious community wasn't what he'd believed it to be. His dreams had stripped away illusions that had made his spiritual life feel secure and meaningful. Augustine faced a crisis of faith that was different from the other monks we've discussed. Instead of wrestling with his own hidden sins or desires, he was dealing with the discovery that his religious community wasn't what he'd believed it to be. His dreams had stripped away illusions that had made his spiritual life feel secure and meaningful. The situation became more complex when Augustine realized that he was now complicit in the corruption simply by remaining silent about what he'd discovered. His dreams had given him knowledge that created moral obligations he wasn't sure how to fulfill. Should he confront the abbot directly, report the problems to church authorities, try to reform the community from within? Augustine spent months wrestling with these questions, praying for guidance about how to respond to information that had come to him through dreams rather than direct observation. He feared that accusing his fellow monks based on dream visions would make him seem mentally unstable or spiritually deluded. The resolution came when Augustine realized that his dreams weren't destroying his faith but refining it. Learning about human imperfection, even among religious people, didn't have to invalidate the spiritual ideals they were all supposedly working toward. His dreams had taught him to distinguish between the eternal values that drew him to religious life and the human institutions that imperfectly attempted to embody those values. Augustine became a voice for reform within his community, using the insights from his dreams to advocate for greater honesty and accountability. His willingness to confront uncomfortable truths while maintaining compassion for human weakness made him a respected figure in the monastery's spiritual renewal. Instead of leaving the monastery or losing faith entirely, Augustine chose to work for change from within. He began having gentle but direct conversations with individual monks about the gap between their stated values and their actual behavior. He volunteered for additional service to the poor, demonstrating through example the kind of authentic charity that he believed religious communities should practice. Augustine's approach was characterized by patience and understanding rather than anger or judgment. He recognized that the corruption he discovered through his dreams was the result of normal human weakness rather than deliberate evil, and he focused on creating conditions where people could choose to live up to their better selves rather than simply condemning them for their failures. His dreams had taught him that spiritual communities are made up of imperfect people working toward perfect ideals, and that this tension between aspiration and reality is part of the human condition rather than evidence that religious life is fundamentally fraudulent. In 1278, Sister Bernadette at a convent in southern France began having dreams that blurred the line between spiritual and romantic love in ways that challenged medieval understanding of both. Bernadette had entered religious life as a young woman with a profound sense of mystical calling. She genuinely experienced prayer as a form of intimate communion with God and found deep satisfaction in her religious vows. Bernadette had discovered her spiritual calling during adolescence, when she began having what she described as direct experiences of divine presence during prayer. Unlike many young women who entered convents for social or economic reasons, Bernadette had begged her parents to allow her to take religious vows because she felt genuinely called to a life of prayer and contemplation. For 6 years, her mystical experiences had provided the foundation for a rich and satisfying spiritual life. Bernadette would spend hours in prayer feeling what she described as divine love flowing through her entire being. She experienced God's presence as something physical and emotional as well as spiritual, a warmth that filled her body, a sense of being completely known and accepted, and periods of spiritual ecstasy that left her feeling more fulfilled than any earthly pleasure could provide. But her dreams began presenting her with scenarios where her love for God became indistinguishable from romantic love for earthly partners. She'd dream about experiencing the same emotional intensity, physical yearning, and passionate devotion toward human lovers that she'd previously directed only toward her relationship with the divine. These dreams weren't exactly sinful in the traditional sense, but they confused categories that medieval religious thought worked hard to keep separate. They suggested that maybe the line between sacred and profane love wasn't as clear as church doctrine claimed. In her dreams, Bernadette would find herself in relationships with men who seemed to combine the qualities she attributed to God with the physical presence and emotional availability of human partners. These dream lovers would understand her completely, accept her unconditionally, and inspire in her the same feelings of devotion and surrender that characterized her prayer life. The psychological complexity was intense because Bernadette couldn't determine whether her dreams were corrupting her spiritual experiences by making them seem merely human, or whether they were revealing that her spiritual experiences had always contained human elements that she'd been trained not to acknowledge. Her dreams forced her to examine the emotional and even physical dimensions of her spiritual experiences in ways that were both disturbing and enlightening. She began to understand that her religious devotion involved aspects of human psychology that were more complex and integrated than she'd previously realized. Instead of seeing this as spiritual failure, Bernadette eventually came to view it as spiritual education about the full spectrum of human love and its relationship to divine love. Her understanding of both became deeper and more psychologically honest as a result of her dream experiences. Bernadette developed practices for distinguishing between the human and divine dimensions of love while recognizing their interconnection. Her later mystical writings became influential for their psychological sophistication and their recognition that authentic spiritual experience involves the whole person, including aspects of human nature that religious training often attempts to separate or suppress. Brother Marcus was a scholar monk who had spent years studying theology, philosophy, and natural science with genuine humility and devotion to truth. Marcus had entered the monastery at 18 with a brilliant mind and an authentic desire to use his intellectual gifts in service of God and spiritual understanding. He'd mastered Latin, Greek, and Arabic, studied the works of Aristotle and Augustine, and developed a reputation as one of the most promising young theologians of his generation. For 7 years, Marcus had approached his scholarly work with what seemed like perfect humility. He genuinely believed that human knowledge was limited and that intellectual pride was one of the most dangerous sins a scholar could commit. He'd seen other learned men become arrogant and dismissive, using their education to humiliate rather than educate others, and he'd consciously committed himself to a different path. Marcus found genuine joy in learning for its own sake, and in using his knowledge to help others understand complex theological and philosophical concepts. He was known for his ability to explain difficult ideas in simple terms, for his patience with students who struggled with abstract concepts, and for his willingness to admit when he didn't know something rather than pretending to expertise he didn't possess. But his dreams began revealing the subtle ways that his pursuit of knowledge was becoming entangled with desires for recognition, superiority, and intellectual dominance over others. In his nightmares, Marcus would find himself using his learning to humiliate less educated people, showing off his knowledge in ways designed to impress rather than to serve truth, and taking pleasure in being considered the smartest person in any gathering. These dreams were particularly challenging because they revealed how easily the pursuit of truth could become contaminated by ego, and how intellectual gifts could become sources of spiritual pride rather than tools for service. The dreams showed Marcus a version of himself that had maintained the external forms of scholarly humility while internally becoming consumed with intellectual vanity and superiority. In one recurring dream, Marcus found himself in theological debates where he would demolish his opponent's arguments not to advance understanding, but to demonstrate his own intellectual superiority. He would use his superior knowledge of languages, philosophy, and scripture to make other people feel stupid and inadequate rather than to help them learn and grow. The psychological impact was profound because Marcus recognized that these dream behaviors represented real temptations he faced in his scholarly work. He began to notice subtle moments when his motivation for studying or teaching was more about impressing others than about serving truth or helping people understand important concepts. Marcus learned to use his dreams as ongoing checks on his motivations for scholarly work, developing practices for keeping his intellectual pursuits aligned with humility and service rather than personal advancement. His experience taught him that true scholarship required constant vigilance against the pride that could corrupt even the most noble intellectual pursuits. Mother Agatha was a nun whose genuine spiritual gifts had earned her a reputation for holiness that extended far beyond her convent. People came from distant regions to seek her prayers and spiritual guidance, believing that her intercession could heal illnesses, resolve family conflicts, and provide divine guidance for difficult decisions. For 12 years, these gifts had felt completely authentic to Agatha. She genuinely experienced divine presence during prayer, received what seemed like supernatural insights about people's spiritual needs, and witnessed apparent miracles that occurred in response to her prayers. Agatha had never sought recognition or fame for her spiritual experiences. They had begun spontaneously during her early years as a nun, when she started having visions during prayer and receiving what she believed were direct communications from God about how to help people who came to her community, seeking spiritual assistance. Her initial response had been humility and even fear. She worried that these experiences might be deceptions or that she might be presuming too much about her relationship with the divine. But the apparent effectiveness of her spiritual gifts had gradually convinced Agatha and her community that she was genuinely blessed with special divine favor. Sick people recovered after she prayed for them, families reconciled after she offered guidance, and individuals found peace and direction through her spiritual counseling. Church authorities had begun investigating her experiences as potentially miraculous, and there was discussion about the possibility that she might eventually be recognized as a saint. But her dreams began showing her how her authentic spiritual experiences were becoming corrupted by the attention and admiration they generated. In these disturbing dreams, Agatha would find herself performing spirituality rather than experiencing it, creating dramatic religious experiences to impress observers, enjoying the reputation for holiness more than the relationship with God that had originally generated it, and gradually losing touch with authentic spiritual experience while maintaining its outward appearance. Her dreams revealed how quickly genuine spiritual gifts could become entangled with very human desires for admiration, respect, and social status. They showed her a version of herself that had learned to manipulate religious experiences for psychological rewards rather than spiritual growth. The dreams started with subtle scenarios where Agatha's motivations for prayer and spiritual practice were mixed rather than pure. She would dream about praying publicly in ways that were designed to impress observers with her holiness, about timing her mystical experiences for maximum dramatic effect, and about enjoying the attention and deference that her reputation brought rather than focusing on genuine communion with God. In one recurring nightmare, Agatha found herself in her convent's chapel, surrounded by visitors who had come to witness her famous spiritual ecstasies. But instead of genuinely entering into prayer, Dream Agatha was consciously performing, calculating which expressions and gestures would most effectively convince observers of her holiness. The psychological complexity was devastating because these dreams revealed motivations that Agatha could recognize in her waking spiritual experiences. She began to notice moments when she was more aware of how impressive she appeared during prayer than of the spiritual content of her prayer itself. The dreams helped Agatha recognize when her spiritual practices were motivated by authentic seeking versus subtle performance, allowing her to maintain the integrity of her inner life even while serving others through her gifts. She learned to distinguish between genuine mystical experience and the human satisfaction that came from being admired for such experiences. Her later spiritual writings became influential for their honest examination of how authentic religious experience could become corrupted by the social recognition it generated, helping other religious figures navigate the complex relationship between genuine spirituality and public spiritual authority. Throughout history, different cultures have had fascinating and completely contradictory ideas about what dreams mean, especially dreams that seem to reveal hidden aspects of our personalities or challenge our most fundamental beliefs. In ancient Egypt, dreams were considered messages from the gods, but they had this interesting belief that disturbing dreams, the kind that revealed hidden sins or forbidden desires, were actually tests, sent by divine forces to strengthen a person's moral character. Egyptian dream interpreters would tell people that nightmares about committing sins were proof that their souls were strong enough to handle spiritual challenges. The Egyptians developed elaborate rituals for what they called dream purification, where people who experienced disturbing dreams would undergo specific ceremonies designed to transform the psychological energy of the dream into spiritual growth. They believed that wrestling with dark dreams in sleep could prevent wrestling with dark impulses in waking life. Think about that for a moment, a culture that saw disturbing dreams not as evidence of hidden corruption, but as proof that someone's spiritual development was progressing to more advanced levels that required more challenging tests. Ancient Greek philosophers had a completely different approach. Aristotle argued that dreams were simply the brain processing memories and sensory experiences from waking life, with no divine or prophetic significance. To Aristotle, a monk dreaming about committing sins would just be evidence that the monk's brain had been exposed to information about sinful behavior and was randomly recombining that information during sleep. But Plato had a more complex view. He thought dreams could reveal aspects of human nature that social conditioning normally kept hidden. In Plato's understanding, a religious person dreaming about sin might be glimpsing authentic aspects of human psychology that religious training had successfully suppressed but not eliminated. It's kind of wild to think about, right? The same dream could be interpreted as divine communication, random brain activity, or psychological revelation depending on which ancient philosopher you consulted. Medieval Christian authorities were deeply conflicted about dreams. On one hand, the Bible contained numerous examples of God communicating through dreams. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel receiving visions, Mary being told about Jesus through dreams. This suggested that dreams could be legitimate forms of divine communication. But medieval theologians were also worried about dreams being sources of temptation or deception from demonic forces. They developed elaborate classification systems to help people distinguish between dreams that came from God, dreams that came from demons, and dreams that were just natural brain processes. St. Augustine, different Augustine from our earlier story, wrote extensively about the spiritual significance of disturbing dreams. He argued that dreams revealing hidden sins or forbidden desires were actually forms of divine mercy, because they allowed people to recognize and address moral weaknesses before they manifested in actual behavior. Augustine believed that God sometimes revealed people's potential for sin through dreams, as a form of spiritual early warning system. A monk who dreamed about breaking his vows was receiving information about spiritual vulnerabilities that needed attention through increased prayer and discipline. This approach treated disturbing dreams as diagnostic tools rather than evidence of moral failure. It was like having a spiritual health examination that revealed problems before they became serious enough to cause actual harm. Medieval Islamic scholars had yet another perspective. They distinguished between true dreams, which came from Allah and contained spiritual guidance, and false dreams, which came from personal anxieties or demonic influences. But they had sophisticated methods for determining which category a particular dream belonged to. Islamic dream interpretation focused heavily on the dreamer's spiritual state and moral character. A person of genuine faith who experienced disturbing dreams was more likely to be receiving divine guidance about spiritual challenges, while someone of questionable character experiencing similar dreams might be dealing with personal psychological issues or spiritual attacks. What's fascinating is how these different cultural approaches to dream interpretation would handle the stories we've been discussing tonight. The same monk wrestling with dreams of lust could be seen as receiving divine guidance, experiencing random brain activity, confronting suppressed psychological material, or being tested by spiritual forces, depending on which interpretive framework you applied. Medieval European monasteries developed interesting practical approaches to managing disturbing dreams. They had specific prayers to recite before sleep, blessed herbs to burn in sleeping areas, and even special diets designed to promote holy dreams rather than troubling ones. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their monks' dream experiences, looking for patterns that might reveal spiritual insights or community-wide challenges that needed attention. These dream journals provide some of our most detailed documentation of medieval psychological and spiritual experiences. Modern sleep science offers some intriguing perspectives on these historical experiences. We now know that REM sleep, when most vivid dreaming occurs, plays a crucial role in processing emotional experiences and consolidating memories. The brain essentially sorts through the day's experiences, filing away important information and discarding unnecessary details. But the brain doesn't just process experiences passively during sleep. It also runs simulations, testing different responses to challenging situations and exploring hypothetical scenarios. This might explain why religious people often dream about violating their vows. Their sleeping minds are essentially running what-if scenarios to strengthen their conscious commitment to their chosen path. There's also fascinating research on what neuroscientists call threat simulation theory. This suggests that many disturbing dreams serve an evolutionary function, allowing our minds to practice responses to dangerous or challenging situations in the safe environment of sleep. For medieval monks and nuns, dreams about sin might have been their brain's way of practicing resistance to temptation, exploring the consequences of different choices, and strengthening their psychological commitment to their religious vows. It's remarkable to think that modern neuroscience and medieval theology might actually agree on some fundamental points about the function of disturbing dreams. Both suggest that wrestling with dark or challenging content in dreams might serve to strengthen our conscious commitment to our chosen values and behaviors. The difference is that medieval religious thinkers saw this process as spiritual warfare between divine and demonic forces, while modern scientists see it as natural brain processes that evolved to help us navigate complex social and moral environments. But there are aspects of the historical dream experiences we've discussed that modern science still struggles to explain. The prophetic elements, the incredible detail and emotional authenticity, and the long-term psychological impacts seem to go beyond what we'd expect from simple memory processing or threat simulation. Maybe there are aspects of consciousness and dreaming that we still don't understand. Maybe the medieval mystics were picking up on something real about the relationship between sleep, consciousness, and spiritual development that our current scientific models haven't fully captured. What I find most compelling about these historical accounts is how they reveal the universal human experience of internal conflict, the gap between who we want to be and who we sometimes fear we actually are. Whether you interpret disturbing dreams as divine messages, psychological processes, or something else entirely, they seem to serve the important function of forcing us to examine our motivations, values, and commitments with uncomfortable honesty. Before we drift off completely tonight, let me share a few dream stories that you probably won't find in any mainstream religious history books, because they're just too weird, too uncomfortable, or too psychologically complex for most historians to know quite what to do with them. In 1453, there was a Benedictine monastery in what's now Switzerland where something absolutely extraordinary happened. Every single monk in the community, all 47 of them, began having the same recurring dream on the same night each week. They would all dream about their monastery being transformed into a magnificent palace, with themselves as wealthy nobles living lives of luxury and indulgence. What made this case so unusual wasn't just the synchronized dreaming, but the fact that the dreams were incredibly detailed and consistent across different individuals. The monks would compare their dream experiences and discover that they'd all seen the same rooms, worn the same expensive clothes, and interacted with the same imaginary characters. The monastery's abbot initially thought this was evidence of demonic influence affecting the entire community. But when they consulted with church authorities, they discovered that similar synchronized dreaming had been reported at other monasteries during periods of particular hardship or spiritual challenge. Some medieval theologians theorized that communities of people living in close spiritual connection could sometimes share dream experiences, especially when they were all wrestling with similar internal conflicts or spiritual questions. Modern researchers have found a few similar cases of synchronized dreaming in isolated communities, research stations in Antarctica, remote military outposts, and even some modern religious communities. There seems to be something about shared environment, common purpose, and intense social bonding that occasionally allows people to have remarkably similar dream experiences. But the mechanisms behind this phenomenon remain completely mysterious. We don't know if it's psychological suggestion, environmental factors, or something else entirely. Here's another story that never made it into official church records. In 1234, at a convent in northern Italy, the nuns developed what they called dream fasting, a practice where they would deliberately try to have disturbing or challenging dreams as a form of spiritual discipline. Sister Magdalena, who developed this practice, believed that confronting sin and temptation in dreams was safer and more effective than waiting for these challenges to arise in waking life. The nuns would pray before sleep to be shown their spiritual weaknesses and hidden desires through dreams, then use these dream experiences as material for confession, meditation, and spiritual growth. What's remarkable is that this practice seemed to work. The nuns reported that after months of dream fasting, they felt more psychologically honest about their motivations and desires, more prepared to handle real-world temptations, and more compassionate toward others who struggled with similar internal conflicts. But the practice was eventually banned by church authorities who felt that deliberately seeking out disturbing dreams was spiritually dangerous and potentially heretical. The official concern was that inviting challenging dream content might actually invite demonic influence rather than divine guidance. And then there's the case of Brother Emmanuel, a French monk who claimed to have learned entire languages through dreams. Starting in 1398, Emmanuel began having dreams where he was fluent in Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew languages he'd never studied while awake. When he woke up, he could remember vocabulary, grammar rules, and even complex theological concepts in these languages with remarkable accuracy. Church scholars tested his knowledge and found that his dream-acquired language skills were genuinely functional, though not perfect. Emmanuel claimed that in his dreams, he was studying with ancient theologians and philosophers who taught him directly in their original languages. Whether this was an extraordinary example of unconscious learning, access to some kind of collective knowledge, or genuine mystical experience remains completely unexplained. Similar cases of dream-acquired knowledge have been reported throughout history. Though they're rare and usually met with skepticism, modern researchers have documented a few instances where people seem to have learned information through dreams that they couldn't have accessed through normal means, but the mechanisms remain mysterious. Perhaps the strangest case involves a 14th century mystic named Marguerite, who claimed that her dreams were actually memories from the lives of other people, past, present, and future. She would dream about being different people in different time periods, experiencing their thoughts, emotions, and daily lives with complete authenticity. Marguerite's dreams apparently included accurate historical details about periods she'd never studied, information about distant places she'd never visited, and even what seemed to be glimpses of future events that later proved accurate. Church authorities initially dismissed her claims, but became concerned when some of her apparent memories from future time periods began coming true. They never knew quite what to make of Marguerite's experiences, and eventually decided it was safer to classify them as mystical experiences rather than trying to determine whether they were psychologically or spiritually real. Sometimes I wonder if these obscure cases represent the far edges of human consciousness, glimpses of capacities or experiences that we don't normally have access to, emerging during the altered state of sleep when our usual mental boundaries become more flexible. Maybe the line between individual consciousness and something larger is thinner than we usually imagine, and dreams occasionally give us access to information, experiences, or perspectives that extend beyond our normal limitations. If you're somehow still awake, which would honestly surprise me, I hope tonight's journey through the conflicted minds of history's most tormented dreamers has given you something to think about, or better yet, something to dream about. We've explored monks wrestling with lust, nuns battling gluttony, priests confronting their capacity for violence, and scholars questioning everything they thought they believed. What strikes me most about all these stories is how they reveal that the most interesting spiritual struggles often happen not between good and evil, but between different versions of ourselves, the person we choose to be during the day and the person our dreams show us we might become. These medieval religious figures discovered what modern psychology is just beginning to understand, that our sleeping minds don't just show us random nonsense, but reveal aspects of human nature that our waking consciousness works hard to keep hidden. Their dreams weren't punishments or temptations, but invitations to understand themselves more completely. Maybe the most profound lesson from these stories is that true spiritual maturity isn't about eliminating all traces of human desire and weakness, but about learning to integrate and understand every aspect of who we are. The monk who never dreams of breaking his vows might be less spiritually developed than the one who dreams of sin every night but chooses service every morning. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they happen to teach you things about yourself that you couldn't learn any other way. So if you've been having your own disturbing dreams lately, maybe they're not signs of hidden corruption or spiritual failure. Maybe they're invitations to examine your choices, understand your motivations, and appreciate the complexity of being human while still choosing to be the person you want to be. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, if you dream about committing medieval sins tonight, you're in excellent historical company. See you in your dreams.